This is the title of the talk today, Jesus' Death, Burial and Resurrection, the evidence and the meaning. It's really interesting how Luke crafts his eyewitness account of Jesus' life. Luke himself wasn't an eyewitness. He was a doctor who became a Christian after Jesus' resurrection. He was a Greek, not a Jew. But he went round with the Apostle Paul, and he went around interviewing all the eyewitnesses, and he compiled this account. We're going to see his method here on your sheets at the top right before I read the passage on the left. Do you see Luke chapter 1 on the top right of your sheets? Luke says, "Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught." Okay, just with your neighbour, I wonder if you want to chat just for a moment about how you think a friend in the office, someone who's not a Christian, someone who's got perhaps preconceived ideas about Christianity would be surprised, or how they would react just to these few verses. Why don't you chat with your neighbour about that? That's helpful. Yeah, so just because he claims it isn't enough in itself, but the fact that he claims that this is his method helps us to think, okay, he's not writing it as myth, or he's not claiming it's myth. We need to work out whether that stacks up. So it's really helpful. I've split up the talk into two main points. One is the evidence, and one is the meaning, because you'll see in Luke's account, he says, many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us. So he doesn't just think that these facts about Jesus are facts. He does think they're facts. He says, from those who from the first were eyewitnesses. So he's investigated the facts, but he doesn't just think it's about the facts. It's about the facts that have a meaning, and that meaning is about fulfillment. Fulfillment of what Jesus said, and bigger than that, fulfillment actually of the whole Old Testament scriptures, the Bible before Jesus. And so that's the way we're going to work through it. We're kind of going to go through twice. First, we're going to go through and look at the eyewitness record of Jesus' death and the early discovery of his resurrection. We'll see a lot more, not next week, but the week after, and then on Easter Day, we'll be looking at the facts of the resurrection much more, but just the early indication. And we're going to just go through these points one by one on your sheets. So first there, the evidence, the eyewitness record. And the most important thing to establish, if there's going to be a claim that someone's risen again, is firstly, there on your sheets, that he was definitely dead. He was definitely dead. Okay. So, Luke chapter 23, verse 44, top left of your sheets. "It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m, for the sun stopped shining. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two. And Jesus called out with a loud voice, 'Father, into your hands I commit my spirit.' And when he had said this, he breathed his last." When he'd said this, he breathed his last. So there, the claim is, he's dead. He's dead. But there's going to be a claim that he rose again. So we've got to find out, was he definitely dead? Well, verse 47, the centurion. So this is an important Roman officer who's in charge of all the soldiers. He would have been in charge of about 100 men, so he would have been in charge of the operation there. And his life, and the life of those who were supposed to be carrying out the execution, would be forfeit, would be lost, if he failed to make sure the execution went through as planned. So the centurion was there, the Roman guards. But actually his reaction, Luke's not recording about him killing him. His reaction there, verse 47, the centurion, seeing what happened, praised God and said, "Surely this was a righteous or an innocent man." Now we'll come back and look at that in the second half of what we work through. But when all the people had gathered to witness this sight, saw what took place, they beat their breasts in a sign of misery and perhaps an element of guilt and just horror, and went away. They knew Jesus had died. Verse 49, but all those who knew him, including the women, now they're going to play a very prominent part in this, who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance watching these things. So there were many witnesses to Jesus dying. So he's definitely dead. Now, next thing is definitely buried. Now this will actually add weight to the question of him definitely dead. So verse 50. Now there was a man named Joseph, a member of the council, a good and upright man, who had not consented to their decision and action. So the council is the council of the Jewish leaders who had gathered together to put Jesus on trial and condemn him to death. And Joseph had somehow been away from that, had absented himself from that. We're told elsewhere in John's Gospel that he was a secret believer, and now's his chance to actually either decide, am I going to remain secret or am I going to come out? And you see verse 52, he comes out. Let's finish at verse 51. So Joseph had not consented to their decision and action. He came from the Judean town of Arimathea, and he himself was waiting for the kingdom of God. Just that detail of where he came from. He's not just some random bloke called Joseph. If he's a prominent member of the ruling council, then he would have been known at the time. So Luke recording this detail, when those who were reading it and sharing it around, it could have been investigated. This is eyewitness kind of detail. It looks like Joseph came from this town nearby, Arimathea, but he had a house and a garden. He was a wealthy man, and a tomb in Jerusalem. So going to Pilate, verse 52, he asked for Jesus' body. Now we're told elsewhere that Pilate was really surprised. In Mark's Gospel, we're told Pilate was really surprised that Jesus was already dead, but it makes sense because he'd had the flogging already, and he'd been nailed to the cross. And so Pilate makes sure that Jesus was definitely dead. We're told in John's Gospel that he ordered the Romans who were executing him to double check, and they shoved a spear in his side, which would have punctured his heart, and that's why we're told blood and water came out. If you want to know the medical detail, ask Penny about why that is. And so Jesus was definitely dead. And then verse 53, then Joseph of Arimathea took down the body, wrapped it in linen cloth, and placed it in a tomb cut in the rock, one in which no one had yet been laid. So this was probably his own family tomb. He'd bought this garden for himself. He dug the tomb for himself. You have to be seriously wealthy to own a tomb, don't you? Anyone here got family members buried in a tomb, like a big visible tomb? You see those in graveyards? No. So you have to be pretty seriously wealthy to have a tomb. Joseph's a wealthy man. He's got that, and he's got it right nearby. And the speed of this that was necessary is worth noting, because Joseph would have needed to. They would have needed to get Jesus into the tomb quickly because of verse 54. It was preparation day, and the Sabbath was about to begin, and the Jews very strictly held to the Sabbath, no work at all, and so they just wrapped him in a linen cloth and put him in the tomb, and then closed the tomb. Verse 55, the women who had come with Jesus from Galilee followed Joseph and saw the tomb and saw how his body was laid in it. Then they went home and prepared spices and perfumes, but they rested on the Sabbath in obedience to the commandment. So normally, if it wasn't the Sabbath about to happen, they would have done all this. They would have taken their time, they would have embalmed him and then sealed the tomb, and that would have been done. But they had to go away and wait and prepare the spices and so on for embalming later. So definitely dead, and not just definitely dead, but definitely buried. And it's interesting, in Christian history, that the emphasis on his burial is there in all the old creeds. So the Apostles' Creed, how does it go? He died, he was buried, and on the third day he rose again. So there's the emphasis on the buried. And that is because often theories rise up that, well, maybe Jesus was just like the other criminals who were crucified, and they got it wrong. He wasn't quite dead, and so they would have taken him and thrown him into a pit with all the other crucified people, and just in that his body would have got lost, and so it would have been very easy to make up a story about him. But actually the fact that we know the details of his burial is very, very important. Very, very important. Okay, definitely dead, definitely buried, definitely gone. On the first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. So the first day of the week is Sunday. So Jesus died on the Friday. He was buried before sundown on the Friday, and then would have remained in the tomb during the Sabbath day. And then you can tell that these women probably were struggling to sleep, and they were desperate to go and do the right thing for Jesus' body and to go and embalm it out of deep respect. Sometimes there's a confusion as to, Jesus sometimes says on the third day he would rise again. And that's easy, so Friday, Saturday, Sunday, okay, that's the third day. Sometimes he says after 3 days he will rise, and people raise a skepticism there. And they say, oh, well, it wasn't after 3 days. It was after less than 2 days, technically. But if we know how counting worked in those days, the third day or after 3 days would have been the same thing. Which floor are we on of this building? If we're American, which floor would we be on? First floor. Okay, it's that kind of equivalent. Okay. If we're American, this would be the first floor. In English, we'd say the ground floor. There, any aspect of a day counts as 1, 2, 3, so third day or 3 days, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. On the first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb. Okay, so this is not what they're expecting. They're expecting that the stone to be sealed. We know from other accounts that they were asking each other, who's going to move this very heavy sealed stone that was guarded by the soldiers? They found the stone rolled away from the tomb. But when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. So they saw something they weren't expecting, and then they didn't see something that they were expecting, which was the body, definitely gone. So they're not going there expecting Jesus to be risen. There's an element of skepticism in them. While they were wondering about this, suddenly 2 men in clothes that gleamed like lightning stood beside them. In their fright, the women bowed down with their faces to the ground, but the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, he has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still with you in Galilee. The Son of Man must be delivered over to the hands of sinners, be crucified, and on the third day be raised again." Then they remembered his words. Okay, so he's definitely gone. And that's put even more strongly by this next point, definitely skeptical. Those who were going to the tomb weren't expecting that Jesus would have gone. They were disillusioned, they were discouraged, they'd been scattered. When Jesus had talked before about his death and burial, they found it really hard to understand. The disciples resisted it. They said, no, surely it won't happen. They thought maybe he was talking in metaphors. How could the Messiah, the king, the one who's going to drive out the Romans and bring in peace on earth, possibly die? That just wasn't in their category of thinking. And so these women, we know they saw Jesus dead. We know they saw where Jesus was laid, so they haven't got the wrong place. And they're going to embalm him with burial spices. They wouldn't go with burial spices if they thought they might see him alive. And so they're skeptical. And they need to be convinced by angels reminding them of Jesus' words. But it's striking, isn't it, how these angels are described? It's just in one throwaway sentence. While they were wondering about this, suddenly 2 men in clothes that gleamed like lightning stood beside them. In their fright, the women bowed down with their faces to the ground. If you've ever read any myth and you get appearances of divine-like beings, you get masses and masses of exaggerated description and so on. Whereas here we just get very simple Luke stating the facts. There's no exaggeration, there's no wows and wonders. It's just stated as it is, something really marvelous. Okay, then definitely skeptical, the women, but then also the men, and we'll read on in verse 9. When they came back from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the others. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the others with them who told this to the apostles. But they did not believe the women because their words seemed to them like nonsense. Okay, so they're definitely skeptical. Even when these women come and report that Jesus is, his body is gone, and that the angels have come and told them that Jesus' body is gone and that he's risen, these broken men, these 11 apostles, I just think that their words sound like nonsense, like babble. And actually, it's very, very striking, and this is something that you could bring up with someone who's skeptical, that the fact that it was women who were the first eyewitnesses of the resurrection, I think almost in terms of logic, almost guarantees that they must have been recording what actually happened. Because if you were going to invent a story of a resurrection, and you were going to create evidence yourself, in those days you definitely wouldn't have had women be the eyewitnesses. Now that may sound surprising in our day, but back in those days, in Jewish society and to an extent in Roman society, a woman's testimony wasn't valid in a court of law. It was such a misogynistic, sexist society that the fact that it was women who witnessed the resurrection would have undermined the case that they were trying to build if they were making it up. And so the only reason that they would put women in the story is if it was actually women who were the first witnesses of the resurrection. So, definitely dead, definitely buried, definitely gone, definitely skeptical. Even Peter's trying to work it out, verse 12, the last verse. Peter, however, got up and ran to the tomb. Bending over, he saw the strips of linen lying by themselves, and he went away wondering to himself what has happened. He's not yet convinced. He's willing to go and check it out, and the facts check up. There he is, the fourth person who would have witnessed the empty tomb, and he sees the strips of linen lying there. Very strikingly about those strips of linen, they would have been the only valuable thing in the tomb, the only thing of any financial value. And so the claim that robbers might have stolen the body, which did happen, there would have been such things as tomb robbers, especially in a rich man's tomb. Robbers often wanted to get in there because they'd be buried with all their treasures and so on. Well, the only thing of any financial value in that tomb would have been the strips of linen. Darshan, you wanted to ask a question?
The fact that women were involved, even the final rights, is it about the maternal instinct that women have a softer heart, maybe, on average, than a man?
As to why they didn't take their...
No, and even they were involved in the latter stages.
It's striking, isn't it, that in a society which was very misogynistic, Jesus deliberately chose women to be the most reliable and faithful to him. And we know that one of those Marys there was sitting at Jesus' feet, listening to his words, being taught by him, just like the men would have been. So I think it's just a high value that Jesus and the gospel accounts gives to women is just very striking.
Especially when you say then, it was far more misogynistic a society.
Yeah.
That's good to
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so Jesus would have looked like a radical feminist in today's terms. Okay. So that's the evidence. The evidence. Any kind of questions on that? Any insights? Any things that you might find helpful just to dig deeper into if you're going to share this with a friend or a colleague? This is a great time of year, isn't it, to talk about what happened at the cross and the resurrection, because it's Easter time. At Ramadan, I know when I had a Muslim colleague, I would ask him more about what's going on at Ramadan. Explain that to me. Why don't we seek out opportunities to explain to people what's going on at Easter?